Part 1, Section 1 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Amy Dunkleberger. My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. Part 1, Section 1. I first met Myra Henshaw when I was 15. But I had known about her ever since I could remember anything at all. She and her runaway marriage were the theme of the most interesting, indeed the only interesting, stories that were told in our family, on holidays or at family dinners. My mother and aunt still heard from Myra Driscoll, as they called her, and Aunt Lydia occasionally went to New York to visit her. She had been the brilliant and attractive figure among the friends of their girlhood, and her life had been as exciting and varied as ours was monotonous. Though she had grown up in our town, Parthia, in southern Illinois, Myra Henshaw never, after her elopement, came back but once. It was in the year when I was finishing high school, and she must then have been a woman of 45. She came in the early autumn, with brief notice by telegraph. Her husband, who had a position in the New York offices of an Eastern railroad, was coming west on business, and they were going to stop over for 2 days in Parthia. He was to stay at the Parthian, as our new hotel was called, and Mrs. Henshaw would stay with Aunt Lydia. I was a favorite with my Aunt Lydia. She had 3 big sons, but no daughter, and she thought my mother scarcely appreciated me. She was always, therefore, giving me what she called advantages on the side. My mother and sister were asked to dinner at Aunt Lydia's on the night of the Henshaws' arrival, but she had whispered to me, "I want you to come in early, an hour or so before the others, and get acquainted with Myra." That evening I slipped quietly in at my aunt's front door, and while I was taking off my wraps in the hall, I could see at the far end of the parlor a short, plump woman in a black velvet dress, seated upon the sofa and softly playing on Cousin Bert's guitar. She must have heard me, and glancing up she saw my reflection in a mirror. She put down the guitar, rose, and stood to await my approach. She stood markedly and pointedly still, with her shoulders back and her head lifted, as if to remind me that it was my business to get to her as quickly as possible and present myself as best I could. I was not accustomed to formality of any sort, but by her attitude she succeeded in conveying this idea to me. I hastened across the room with so much bewilderment and concern in my face that she gave a short commiserating laugh as she held out to me her plump, charming little hand. "Certainly this must be Lydia's dear Nellie, of whom I've heard so much. And you must be 15 now, by my mournful arithmetic. Am I right?" What a beautiful voice, bright and gay and carelessly kind. But she continued to hold her head up haughtily. She always did this on meeting people, partly, I think, because she was beginning to have a double chin and was sensitive about it. Her deep-set, flashing gray eyes seemed to be taking me in altogether, estimating me. For all that she was no taller than I felt quite overpowered by her, and stupid, hopelessly clumsy and stupid. Her black hair was done high on her head, à la pompadour, and there were curious zigzag curly streaks of glistening white in it, which made it look like the fleece of a Persian goat or some animal that bore silky fur. I could not meet the playful curiosity of her eyes at all, so I fastened my gaze upon a necklace of carved amethysts she wore inside the square-cut neck of her dress. I suppose I stared, for she said suddenly, "Does this necklace annoy you? I'll take it off if it does." I was utterly speechless. I could feel my cheeks burning. Seeing that she had hurt me, she was sorry, threw her arm impulsively about me, drew me into the corner of the sofa, and sat down beside me. "Oh, we'll get used to each other. You see, I brought you because I'm certain that Lydia and your mother have spoiled you a little. You've been overpraised to me. It's all very well to be clever, my dear, but you mustn't be solemn about it. Nothing is more tiresome. Now, let us get acquainted. Tell me about the things you like best. That's the shortcut to friendship. What do you like best in Parthia, the old Driscoll place? I knew it. By the time her husband came in, I had begun to think she was going to like me. I wanted her to, but I felt I didn't have half a chance with her. Her charming, fluent voice, her clear, light enunciation bewildered me, and I was never sure whether she was making fun of me or of the thing we were talking about. Her sarcasm was so quick, so fine at the point. It was like being touched by a metal so cold that one doesn't know whether one is burned or chilled. I was fascinated but very ill at ease, and I was glad when Oswald Henshaw arrived from the hotel. He came into the room without taking off his overcoat and went directly up to his wife, who rose and kissed him. Again, I was some time in catching up with the situation. I wondered for a moment whether they might have come down from Chicago on different trains, for she was clearly glad to see him, glad not merely that he was safe and had got round on time, but because his presence gave her lively personal pleasure. I was not accustomed to that kind of feeling in people long married. Mr. Henshaw was less perplexing than his wife, and he looked more as I had expected him to look. The prominent bones of his face gave him a rather military air, a broad, rugged forehead, high cheekbones, a high nose slightly arched. His eyes, however, were dark and soft, curious in shape, exactly like half-moons, and he wore a limp, drooping mustache like an Englishman. There was something about him that suggested personal bravery, magnanimity, and a fine, generous way of doing things. "I am late," he explained, "because I had some difficulty in dressing. I couldn't find my things." His wife looked concerned for a moment, and then began to laugh softly. "Poor Oswald, you were looking for your new dress shirts that bulge in front. Well, you needn't. I gave them to the janitor's son." "The janitor's son?" "Yes, to Willie Bunch, at home. He's probably wearing one to an Iroquois ball tonight, and that's the right place for it." Mr. Henshaw passed his hand quickly over his smooth iron-gray hair. "You gave away my 6 new shirts?" "Be sure I did. You shan't wear shirts that give you a bosom, not if we go to the poorhouse. You know I can't bear you in ill-fitting things." Oswald looked at her with amusement, incredulity, and bitterness. He turned away from us with a shrug and pulled up a chair. "Well, all I can say is, what a windfall for Willie." "That's the way to look at it," said his wife teasingly. "And now try to talk about something that might conceivably interest Lydia's niece. I promised Liddy to make a salad dressing." I was left alone with Mr. Henshaw. He had a pleasant way of giving his whole attention to a young person. He drew one out better than his wife had done, because he did not frighten one so much. I liked to watch his face with its outstanding bones and languid, friendly eyes, that perplexing combination of something hard and something soft. Soon my mother and uncle and my boy cousins arrived. When the party was complete, I could watch and enjoy the visitors without having to think of what I was going to say next. The dinner was much gayer than family parties usually are. Mrs. Henshaw seemed to remember all the old stories and the old jokes that had been asleep for 20 years. "How good it is," my mother exclaimed, "to hear Myra laugh again." Yes, it was good. It was sometimes terrible, too, as I was to find out later. She had an angry laugh, for instance, that I still shivered to remember. Any stupidity made Myra laugh. I was destined to hear that one very often. Untoward circumstances, accidents, even disasters provoked her mirth. And it was always mirth, not hysteria. There was a spark of zest and wild humor in it. End of Part 1, Section 1. Part 1, Section 2 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 1, Section 2. The big stone house, set in its 10-acre park of trees and surrounded by a high wrought-iron fence, in which Myra Driscoll grew up, was still, in my time, the finest property in Parthia. At John Driscoll's death it went to the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, and I could remember it only as a convent. Myra was an orphan, and had been taken into this house as a very little girl and brought up by her great-uncle. John Driscoll made his fortune employing contract labor in the Missouri swamps. He retired from business early, returned to the town where he had been a poor boy, and built a fine house in which he took great pride. He lived in what was considered great splendor in those days. He kept fast horses, and bred a trotter that made a national record. He bought silver instruments for the town band, and paid the salary of the bandmaster. When the band went up to serenade him on his birthday and on holidays, he called the boys in and treated them to his best whiskey. If Myra gave a ball or a garden party, the band furnished the music. It was, indeed, John Driscoll's band. Myra, as my aunt often said, had everything: dresses and jewels, a fine riding horse, a Steinway piano. Her uncle took her back to Ireland with him one summer, and had her painted by a famous painter. When they were at home in Parthia, his house was always open to the young people of the town. Myra's good looks and high spirits gratified the old man's pride. Her wit was of the kind that he could understand, native and racy, and none too squeamish. She was very fond of him, and he knew it. He was a coarse old codger, so unlettered that he made a poor showing with a pen. It was always told of him that when he became president of our national bank, he burned a lot of the treasury notes sent up to his house for him to sign, because he had spoiled the signature. But he knew a great deal about men and their motives. In his own way he was picturesque, and Myra appreciated it. Not many girls would have done so. Indeed, she was a good deal like him. The blood tie was very strong. There was never a serious disagreement between them until it came to young Henshaw. Oswald Henshaw was the son of a German girl of good family, and an Ulster Protestant whom Driscoll detested. There was an old grudge of some kind between the two men. This Ulster man was poor and impractical, a wandering schoolmaster who had charge for a while of the high school in Parthia, and afterwards taught in smaller towns about. Oswald put himself through Harvard with very little help from his parents. He was not taken account of in our town until he came home from college, a handsome and promising young man. He and Myra met as if for the first time and fell in love with each other. When old Driscoll found that Oswald was calling on his niece, he forbade him the house. They continued to meet at my grandfather's, however, under the protection of my Aunt Lydia. Driscoll so persecuted the boy that he felt there was no chance for him in Parthia. He roused himself and went to New York. He stayed there 2 years without coming home, sending his letters to Myra through my aunt. All Myra's friends were drawn into the web of her romance. 6 young men understudied for Oswald so assiduously that her uncle might have thought she was going to marry any one of them. Oswald, meanwhile, was pegging away in New York, at a time when salaries were small and advancement was slow. But he managed to get on, and in 2 years he was in a position to marry. He wrote to John Driscoll, telling him his resources and prospects, and asked him for his niece's hand. It was then that Driscoll had it out with Myra. He did not come at her in a tantrum, as he had done before, but confronted her with a cold business proposition. If she married young Henshaw, He would cut her off without a penny. He could do so because he had never adopted her. If she did not, she would inherit 2/3 of his property. The remaining third was to go to the church. "And I advise ye to think well," he told her. "It's better to be a stray dog in this world than a man without money. I've tried both ways, and I know. A poor man stinks, and God hates him." Some months after this conversation, Myra went out with a sleighing party. They drove her to a neighboring town where Oswald's father had a school, and where Oswald himself had quietly arrived the day before. There, in the presence of his parents and of Myra's friends, they were married by the civil authority, and they went away on the Chicago Express, which came through at 2 a.m. When I was a little girl, my Aunt Lydia used to take me for a walk along the broad stone flagging that ran all the way around the old Driscoll grounds. Through the high iron fence we could see the sisters, out for recreation, pacing 2 and 2 under the apple trees. My aunt would tell me again about that thrilling night, probably the most exciting in her life, when Myra Driscoll came down that path from the house and out of those big iron gates for the last time. She had wanted to leave without taking anything but the clothes she wore, and indeed she walked out of the house with nothing but her muff and her porte-monnaie in her hands. My prudent aunt, however, had put her toilet articles and some linen into a travelling bag and thrown it out of the back window to one of the boys stationed under an apple tree. "I'll never forget the sight of her, coming down that walk and leaving a great fortune behind her," said Aunt Lydia. "I had gone out to join the others before she came. She preferred to leave the house alone. We girls were all in sleighs, and the boys stood in the snow holding the horses. We had begun to think she had weakened, or maybe gone to the old man to try to move him. But we saw by the lights behind when the front door opened and shut, and here she came with her head high, and that quick little bouncing step of hers. Your Uncle Rob lifted her into the sleigh, and off we went. And that hard old man was as good as his word. Her name wasn't mentioned in his will. He left it all to the Catholic Church and to institutions." "But they've been happy, anyhow?" I sometimes asked her. "Happy? Oh, yes, as happy as most people." That answer was disheartening. The very point of their story was that they should be much happier than other people. When I was older, I used to walk around the Driscoll place alone very often, especially on spring days after school, and watch the nuns pacing so mildly and measuredly among the blossoming trees where Myra used to give garden parties and have the band to play for her. I thought of the place as being under a spell, like the Sleeping Beauty's palace. It had been in a trance or lain in its flowers like a beautiful corpse ever since that winter night when love went out of the gates and gave the dare to fate. Since then, chanting and devotions and discipline, and the tinkle of little bells that seemed forever calling the sisters into prayers. I knew that this was not literally true. Old John Driscoll had lived on there for many years after the flight of his niece. I myself could remember his funeral, remember it very vividly, though I was not more than 6 years old when it happened. I sat with my parents in the front of the gallery, at the back of the church that the old man had enlarged and enriched during the latter days of his life. The high altar blazed with hundreds of candles. The choir was entirely filled by the masses of flowers. The bishop was there, and a flock of priests in gorgeous vestments. When the pallbearers arrived, Driscoll did not come up to the church. The church went to him. The bishop and clergy went down the nave and met that great black coffin at the door, preceded by the cross and boys swinging cloudy censers, followed by the choir chanting to the organ. They surrounded, they received, they seemed to assimilate into the body of the church, the body of old John Driscoll. They bore it up to the high altar on a river of color and incense and organ tone. They claimed it, and enclosed it. In after years, when I went to other funerals, stark and grim enough, I thought of John Driscoll as having escaped the end of all flesh. It was as if he had been translated, with no dark conclusion to the pageant, no night of the grave about which our Protestant preachers talked. From the freshness of roses and lilies, from the glory of the high altar, he had gone straight to the greater glory, through smoking censers and candles and stars. After I went home from that first glimpse of the real Myra Henshaw, 25 years older than I had always imagined her, I could not help feeling a little disappointed. John Driscoll and his niece had suddenly changed places in my mind, and he had got, after all, the more romantic part. Was it not better to get out of the world with such pomp and dramatic splendor than to linger on in it, having to take account of shirts and railway trains and getting a double chin into the bargain? The Henshaws were in Parthia 3 days, and when they left, it was settled that I was to go on to New York with Aunt Lydia for the Christmas holidays. We were to stay at the old Fifth Avenue Hotel, which, as Myra said, was only a stone's throw from their apartment. If at any time a body was to feel disposed to throw one, Liddy. End of Part 1, Section 2. Part 1, Section 3 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 1, Section 3. My Aunt Lydia and I arrived at the Jersey City station on the day before Christmas, a soft gray December morning with a little snow falling. Myra Henshaw was there to meet us, very handsome, I thought, as she came walking rapidly up the platform, her plump figure swathed in furs, a fur hat on her head, with a single narrow garnet feather sticking out behind, like the pages' caps in old story-books. She was not alone. She was attended by a tall, elegant young man in a blue-gray ulster. He had one arm through hers, and in the other hand he carried a walking-stick. "This is Ewan Gray," said Mrs. Henshaw, after she had embraced us. "Doubtless you have seen him play in Chicago. He is meeting an early train, too, so we planned to salute the morn together, and left Oswald to breakfast alone." The young man took our hand luggage and walked beside me to the ferry-boat, asking polite questions about our trip. He was a Scotchman of an old theatrical family, a handsome fellow with a broad fair-skinned face, sand-colored hair and mustache, and fine grey eyes, deep-set and melancholy, with black lashes. He took us up to the deck of the ferry, and then Mrs. Henshaw told him he had better leave us. "You must be there when Esther's train gets in, and remember, you are to bring her to dine with us tomorrow night. There will be no one else." "Thank you, Myra." He stood looking down at her with a grateful, almost humble expression, holding his soft hat against his breast, while the snowflakes fell about his head. "And may I call in for a few moments tonight to show you something?" She laughed as if his request pleased her. "Something for her, I expect. Can't you trust your own judgment?" "You know I never do," he said, as if that were an old story. She gave him a little push. "Do put your hat on, or you'll greet Esther with the sneeze. Run along." She watched him anxiously as he walked away, and groaned, "Oh, the deliberation of him! If I could only make him hurry once! You'll hear all about him later, Nellie. You'll have to see a good deal of him, but you won't find it a hardship, I trust." The boat was pulling out, and I was straining my eyes to catch, through the fine reluctant snow, my first glimpse of the city we were approaching. We passed the Wilhelm der Grosse, coming up the river under tug, her sides covered with ice after a stormy crossing, a flock of seagulls in her wake. The snow blurred everything a little, and the buildings on the Battery all ran together, looked like an enormous fortress with 1,000 windows. From the mass, the dull gold dome of the World Building emerged like a ruddy autumn moon at twilight. From the 23rd Street station we took the crosstown car — people were economical in those days — to the Fifth Avenue Hotel. After we had unpacked and settled our things, we went across the square to lunch at Purcell's, and there Mrs. Henshaw told us about Ewan Gray. He was in love with one of her dearest friends, Esther Sinclair, whose company was coming into New York for the holidays. Though he was so young, he had, she said, a rather spotty past, and Miss Sinclair, who was the daughter of an old New England family and had been properly brought up, couldn't make up her mind whether he was stable enough to marry. I don't dare advise her, though I am so fond of him. You can see he's just the sort of boy that women pick up and run off into the jungle with. But he's never wanted to marry before. It might be the making of him. He's distractedly in love, goes about like a sleepwalker. Still, I couldn't bear it if anything cruel happened to Esther. Aunt Lydia and Myra were going to do some shopping. When we went out into Madison Square again, Mrs. Henshaw must have seen my wistful gaze, for she stopped short and said, "How would Nellie like it if we left her here and picked her up as we come back? That's our house over there, 2nd floor, so you won't be far from home. To me, this is the real heart of the city. That's why I love living here." She waved to me and hurried my aunt away. Madison Square was then at the parting of the ways, had a double personality, half commercial, half social, with shops to the south and residences on the north. It seemed to me so neat after the raggedness of our western cities, so protected by good manners and courtesy, like an open-air drawing-room. I could well imagine a winter dancing party being given there, or a reception for some distinguished European visitor. The snow fell lightly all the afternoon, and friendly old men with brooms kept sweeping the paths, very ready to talk to a girl from the country, and to brush off a bench so that she could sit down. The trees and shrubbery seemed well groomed and sociable, like pleasant people. The snow lay in clinging folds on the bushes, and outlined every twig of every tree, a line of white upon a line of black. Madison Square Garden, new and spacious then, looked to me so light and fanciful, and St. Gaudens's Diana, of which Mrs. Henshaw had told me, stepped out freely and fearlessly into the grey air. I lingered long by the intermittent fountain. Its rhythmical splash was like the voice of the place. It rose and fell like something taking deep, happy breaths, and the sound was musical, seemed to come from the throat of spring. Not far away, on the corner, was an old man selling English violets, each bunch wrapped in oiled paper to protect them from the snow. Here, I felt, winter brought no desolation. It was tamed, like a polar bear led on a leash by a beautiful lady. About the square the pale blue shadows grew denser and drew closer. The street lamps flashed out all along the avenue, and soft lights began to twinkle in the tall buildings, while it was yet day. Violet buildings just a little denser in substance and color than the violet sky. While I was gazing up at them, I heard a laugh close beside me, and Mrs. Henshaw's arm slipped through mine. "Why, you're fair moonstruck, Nellie. I've seen the messenger boys dodging all about you." It was true. Droves of people were going through the square now, and boys carrying potted plants and big wreaths. "Don't you like to watch them? But we can't stay. We're going home to Oswald. Oh, hear the penny whistle. They always find me out." She stopped a thin lad with a cap and yarn comforter but no overcoat, who was playing the Irish washerwoman on a little pipe, and rummaged in her bag for a coin. The Henshaws' apartment was the second floor of an old brownstone house on the north side of the square. I loved it from the moment I entered it. Such solidly built, high-ceiled rooms, with snug fireplaces and wide doors and deep windows. The long, heavy velvet curtains and the velvet chairs were a wonderful plum color, like ripe purple fruit. The curtains were lined with that rich cream color that lies under the blue skin of ripe figs. Oswald was standing by the fire, drinking a whiskey and soda while he waited for us. He put his glass down on the mantel as we opened the door and forgot all about it. He pushed chairs up to the hearth for my aunt and me and stood talking to us, while his wife went to change her dress and to have a word with the Irish maid before dinner. "By the way, Myra," he said as she left us, "I've put a bottle of champagne on ice. It's Christmas Eve." Everything in their little apartment seemed to me absolutely individual and unique, even the dinner service. The thick grey plates and the soup tureen painted with birds and big bright flowers. I was sure there were no others like them in the world. As we were finishing dinner, the maid announced Mr. Gray. Henshaw went into the parlor to greet him, and we followed a moment later. The young man was in evening clothes, with a few sprays of white hyacinth in his coat. He stood by the fire, his arm on the mantel. His clean, fair skin and melancholy eyes, his very correct clothes, and something about the shape of his hands, made one conscious of a cool, deliberate fastidiousness in him. In spite of his spotty past, he looked, that night, as fresh and undamaged as the flowers he wore. Henshaw took on a slightly bantering tone with him, and seemed to be trying to cheer him up. Mr. Gray would not sit down. After an interval of polite conversation, he said to his host, "Will you excuse me if I take Myra away for a few moments? She has promised to do something kind for me." They went into Henshaw's little study, off the parlor, and shut the door. We could hear a low murmur of voices. When they came back to us, Mrs. Henshaw stood beside Gray while he put on his caped cloak, talking encouragingly. "The opals are beautiful, but I'm afraid of them, Ewan. Oswald would laugh at me, but all the same they have a bad history. Love itself draws on a woman nearly all the bad luck in the world. Why, for mercy's sake, add opals?" "He brought 2 bracelets for me to decide between them, Oswald, both lovely. However did they let you carry off 2, Ewan?" "They know me there. I always pay my bills, Myra. I don't know why, but I do. I suppose it's the Scot in me." He wished us all good night. "Give a kiss to Esther for me," said Mrs. Henshaw merrily at the door. He made no reply, but bent over her hand and vanished. "What he really wanted was to show me some verses he's made for her," said Mrs. Henshaw as she came back to the fire. "And very pretty ones they are, for sweetheart poetry." Mr. Henshaw smiled. "Maybe you obliged him with a rhyme or 2, my dear?" "Lydia." He sat down by my aunt and put his hand on hers. "I'd never feel sure that I did my own courting if it weren't that I was a long way off at the time. Myra is so fond of helping young men along. We nearly always have a love affair on hand." She put her hand over his lips. "Hush! I hate old women who egg on courtships." When Oswald had finished his cigar, we were taken out for a walk. This was primarily for the good of her figure, Myra said, and incidentally we were to look for a green bush to send to Madame Majeska. She's spending the holidays in town, and it will be dismal at her hotel. At the florist we found, among all the little trees and potted plants, a glistening holly tree, full of red berries and pointed like a spire, easily the queen of its companions. "That is naturally hers," said Mrs. Myra. Her husband shrugged. "It's naturally the most extravagant." Mrs. Myra threw up her head. "Don't be petty, Oswald. It's not a woolen petticoat or warm mittens that Madame is needing." She gave careful instructions to the florist's man who was to take the tree to the Savoy. He was to carry with it a box of cakes, of my baking, she said proudly. He was to ask for Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, and under her guidance he was to carry the tree up to Madame Modjeska's rooms himself. The man showed a sympathetic interest and promised to follow instructions. Then Mrs. Henshaw gave him a silver dollar and wished him a Merry Christmas. As we walked home, she slipped her arm through mine, and we fell a little behind the other two. "See the moon coming out, Nellie, behind the tower? It wakens the guilt in me. No playing with love, and I'd sworn a great oath never to meddle again. You send a handsome fellow like you in gray to a fine girl like Esther, and it's Christmas Eve, and they rise above us and the white world around us, and there isn't anybody, not a tramp on the park benches, that wouldn't wish them well, and very likely hell will come of it." End of Part 1, Section 3. Part 1, Section 4 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 1, Section 4. The next morning, Oswald Henshaw, in a frock coat and top hat, called to take Aunt Lydia and me to church. The weather had cleared before we went to bed, and as we stepped out of our hotel that morning, the sun shone blindingly on the snow-covered park. The gold Diana flashed against a green-blue sky. We were going to Grace Church, and the morning was so beautiful that we decided to walk. "Lydia," said Henshaw as he took us each by an arm, "I want you to give me a Christmas present." "Why, Oswald," she stammered. "Oh, I have it ready. You've only to present it." He took a little flat package from his pocket and slipped it into her muff. He drew both of us closer to him. "Listen, it's nothing. It's some sleeve buttons given me by a young woman who means no harm, but doesn't know the ways of the world very well. She's from a breezy western city where a rich girl can give a present whenever she wants to and nobody questions it. She sent these to my office yesterday. If I send them back to her, it will hurt her feelings. She would think I had misunderstood her. She'll get hard knocks here, of course, but I don't want to give her any. On the other hand, well, you know Myra. Nobody better. She would punish herself and everybody else for this young woman's questionable taste. So I want you to give them to me, Lydia." "Oh, Oswald," cried my aunt, "Myra is so keen. I'm not clever enough to fool Myra. Can't you just put them away in your office?" "Not very well. Besides," he gave a slightly embarrassed laugh, "I'd like to wear them. They are very pretty." "Now, Oswald." "Oh, it's all right, Lydia. I give you my word it is. But you know how a little thing of that sort can upset my wife. I thought you might give them to me when you come over to dine with us tomorrow night. She wouldn't be jealous of you. But if you don't like the idea, why, just take them home with you and give them to some nice boy who would appreciate them." All through the Christmas service, I could see that Aunt Lydia was distracted and perplexed. As soon as we got back to the hotel and were safe in our rooms, she took the brown leather case from her muff and opened it. The sleeve buttons were topazes, winey yellow, lightly set in crinkly gold. I believe she was seduced by their beauty. I really think he ought to have them if he wants them. Everything is always for Myra. He never gets anything for himself. And all the admiration is for her. Why shouldn't he have a little? He has been devoted to a fault. It isn't good for any woman to be humored and pampered as he has humored her. And she's often most unreasonable with him. Most unreasonable. The next evening, as we were walking across the square to the Henshaws, we glanced up and saw them standing together in one of their deep front windows, framed by the plum-colored curtains. They were looking out, but did not see us. I noticed that she was really quite a head shorter than he, and she leaned a little towards him. When she was peaceful, she was like a dove with its wings folded. There was something about them, as they stood in the lighted window, that would have discouraged me from meddling, but it did not shake my aunt. As soon as we were in the parlor, before we had taken off our coats, she said resolutely, "Myra, I want to give Oswald a Christmas present. Once an old friend left with me some cuff-links he couldn't keep, unpleasant associations, I suppose. I thought of giving them to one of my own boys, but I brought them for Oswald. I'd rather he would have them than anybody." Aunt Lydia spoke with an ease and conviction which compelled my admiration. She took the buttons out of her muff, without the box, of course, and laid them in Mrs. Henshaw's hand. Mrs. Henshaw was delighted. "How clever of you to think of it, Liddy dear. Yes, they're exactly right for him. There's hardly any other stone I would like, but these are exactly right. Look, Oswald, they're the color of a fine Moselle." It was Oswald himself who seemed disturbed and not overpleased. He grew red, was confused in his remarks, and was genuinely reluctant when his wife insisted upon taking the gold buttons out of his cuffs and putting in the new ones. "I can't get over your canniness, Liddy," she said as she fitted them. "It's not like me, is it, Myra?" retorted my aunt. "Not like me at all to choose the right sort of thing. But did it never occur to you that anyone besides yourself might know what is appropriate for Oswald? No, I'm sure it never did." Mrs. Myra took the laugh so heartily to herself that I felt it was a shame to deceive her. So, I'm sure, did Oswald. During dinner he talked more than usual, but he was ill at ease. Afterwards, at the opera, when the lights were down, I noticed that he was not listening to the music, but was looking listlessly off into the gloom of the house, with something almost sorrowful in his strange half-moon eyes. During an entr'acte, a door at the back was opened, and a draught blew in. As he put his arm back to pull up the cloak which had slipped down from his wife's bare shoulders, she laughed and said, "Oh, Oswald, I love to see your jewels flash." He dropped his hand quickly and frowned so darkly that I thought he would have liked to put the topazes under his heel and grind them up. I thought him properly served then, but often since I have wondered at his gentle heart. End of Part 1, Section 4. Part 1, Section 5 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 1, Section 5. During the week between Christmas and New Year's Day, I was with Mrs. Henshaw a great deal, but we were seldom alone. It was the season of calls and visits, and she said that meeting so many people would certainly improve my manners and my English. She hated my careless, slangy Western speech. Her friends, I found, were of two kinds: artistic people, actors, musicians, literary men, with whom she was always at her best because she admired them, and another group whom she called her moneyed friends. She seemed to like the word, and these she cultivated, she told me, on Oswald's account. "He is the sort of man who does well in business only if he has the incentive of friendships. He doesn't properly belong in business. We never speak of it, but I'm sure he hates it. He went into an office only because we were young and terribly in love and had to be married." The business friends seemed to be nearly all Germans. On Sunday we called at half a dozen or more big houses. I remember very large rooms, much upholstered and furnished, walls hung with large paintings in massive frames, and many stiff, dumpy little sofas in which the women sat 2 and 2, while the men stood about the refreshment tables, drinking champagne and coffee and smoking fat black cigars. Among these people Mrs. Myra took on her loftiest and most challenging manner. I could see that some of the women were quite afraid of her. They were in great haste to rush refreshments to her and looked troubled when she refused anything. They addressed her in German and profusely complimented her upon the way she spoke it. We had a carriage that afternoon, and Myra was dressed in her best, making an especial effort on Oswald's account. But the rich and powerful irritated her. Their solemnity was too much for her sense of humor. There was a biting edge to her sarcasm, a curl about the corners of her mouth that was never there when she was with people whose personality charmed her. I had one long, delightful afternoon alone with Mrs. Henshaw in Central Park. We walked for miles, stopped to watch the skating, and finally had tea at the casino, where she told me about some of the singers and actors I would meet at her apartment on New Year's Eve. Her account of her friends was often more interesting to me than the people themselves. After tea she hailed a hansom and asked the man to drive us about the park a little, as a fine sunset was coming on. We were jogging happily along under the elms, watching the light change on the crusted snow, when a carriage passed from which a handsome woman leaned out and waved to us. Mrs. Henshaw bowed stiffly with a condescending smile. "There, Nellie," she exclaimed, "that's the last woman I'd care to have splashing past me. And me in a hansom cab." I glimpsed what seemed to me insane ambition. My aunt was always thanking God that the Henshaws got along as well as they did, and worrying because she felt sure Oswald wasn't saving anything. And here Mrs. Myra was, wishing for a carriage, with stables and a house and servants, and all that went with a carriage. All the way home she kept her scornful expression, holding her head high and sniffing the purple air from side to side as we drove down Fifth Avenue. When we alighted before her door, she paid the driver and gave him such a large fee that he snatched off his hat and said twice, thank you, my lady." She dismissed him with a smile and a nod. "All the same," she whispered to me as she fitted her latchkey, "it's very nasty being poor." That week Mrs. Henshaw took me to see a dear friend of hers, Anne Allward, the poet. She was a girl who had come to New York only a few years before, had won the admiration of men of letters, and was now dying of tuberculosis in her early 20s. Mrs. Henshaw had given me a book of her poems to read, saying, "I want you to see her so that you can remember her in after years, and I want her to see you so that we can talk you over." Miss Allward lived with her mother in a small flat overlooking the East River, and we found her in a bath chair, lying in the sun and watching the river boats go by. Her study was a delightful place that morning, full of flowers and plants and baskets of fruit that had been sent her for Christmas. But it was Myra Henshaw herself who made that visit so memorably gay. Never had I seen her so brilliant and strangely charming as she was in that sunlit study up under the roofs. Their talk quite took my breath away. They said such exciting, such fantastic things about people, books, music, anything. They seemed to speak together a kind of highly flavored special language. As we were walking home, she tried to tell me more about Miss Allward, but tenderness for her friend and bitter rebellion at her fate choked her voice. She suffered physical anguish for that poor girl. My aunt often said that Myra was incorrigibly extravagant, but I saw that her chief extravagance was in caring for so many people and in caring for them so much. When she but mentioned the name of someone whom she admired, One got an instant impression that the person must be wonderful. Her voice invested the name with a sort of grace. When she liked people, she always called them by name a great many times in talking to them, and she enunciated the name, no matter how commonplace, in a penetrating way, without hurrying over it or slurring it. And this, accompanied by her singularly direct gaze, had a curious effect. When she addressed Aunt Lydia, for instance, she seemed to be speaking to a person deeper down than the blurred, taken-for-granted image of my aunt that I saw every day, and for a moment my aunt became more individual, less matter-of-fact to me. I had noticed this peculiar effect of Myra's look and vocative when I first met her in Parthia, where her manner of addressing my relatives had made them all seem a little more attractive to me. One afternoon when we were at a matinée, I noticed in a loge a young man who looked very much like the photographs of a story writer popular at that time. I asked Mrs. Henshaw whether it could be he. She looked in the direction I indicated, then looked quickly away again. "Yes, it's he. He used to be a friend of mine. That's a sad phrase, isn't it? But there was a time when he could have stood by Oswald in a difficulty, and he didn't. He passed it up. Wasn't there. I've never forgiven him." I regretted having noticed the man in the loge. For all the rest of the afternoon I could feel the bitterness working in her. I knew that she was suffering. The scene on the stage was obliterated for her. The drama was in her mind. She was going over it all again, arguing, accusing, denouncing. As we left the theater, she sighed. "Oh, Nellie, I wish you hadn't seen him. It's all very well to tell us to forgive our enemies. Our enemies can never hurt us very much. But oh, what about forgiving our friends?" She beat on her fur collar with her two gloved hands. "That's where the rub comes." The Henshaws always gave a party on New Year's Eve. That year most of the guests were stage people. Some of them, in order to get there before midnight, came with traces of make-up still on their faces. I remember old Jefferson de Angelet arrived in his last act wig, carrying his plumed hat. During the supper his painted eyebrows spread and came down over his eyes like a veil. Most of them are dead now, but it was a fine group that stood about the table to drink the New Year in. By far the handsomest and most distinguished of that company was a woman no longer young, but beautiful in age, Helena Modjeska. She looked a woman of another race and another period, no less queenly than when I had seen her in Chicago as Marie Stuart and as Catherine in Henry VIII. I remember how, when Oswald asked her to propose a toast, she put out her long arm, lifted her glass, and looking into the blur of the candlelight with a grave face, said, "To my country." As she was not playing, she had come early, some time before the others, bringing with her a young Polish woman who was singing at the opera that winter. I had an opportunity to watch Modjeska as she sat talking to Myra and Esther Sinclair. Miss Sinclair had once played in her company. When the other guests began to arrive, and Myra was called away, she sat by the fire in a high-backed chair, her head resting lightly on her hand, her beautiful face half in shadow. How well I remember those long, beautifully modelled hands with so much humanity in them. They were worldly indeed, but fashioned for a nobler worldliness than ours, hands to hold a sceptre or a chalice, or, by courtesy, a sword. The party did not last long, but it was a whirl of high spirits. Everybody was hungry and thirsty. There was a great deal of talk about Sarah Bernhardt's Hamlet, which had been running all week and had aroused hot controversy, and about Jean de Resque's return to the Metropolitan that night, after a long illness in London. By 2 o'clock every one had gone but the two Polish ladies. Modjeska, after she put on her long cloak, went to the window, drew back the plum-colored curtains, and looked out. "See, Myra," she said with that Slav accent she never lost, though she read English verse so beautifully. "The square is quite white with moonlight, and how still all the city is, how still." She turned to her friend. "Emilia, I think you must sing something. Something old, yes, from Norma." She hummed a familiar air under her breath and looked about for a chair. Oswald brought one. "Thank you, and we might have less light, might we not?" He turned off the lights. She sat by the window, half draped in her cloak, the moonlight falling across her knees. Her friend went to the piano and commenced the Casta Diva aria, which begins so like the quivering of moonbeams on the water. It was the first air on our old music box at home, but I had never heard it sung, and I have never heard it sung so beautifully since. I remember Oswald standing like a statue behind Madame Modjeska's chair, and Myra crouching low beside the singer, her head in both hands, while the song grew and blossomed like a great emotion. When it stopped, nobody said anything beyond a low goodbye. Modjeska again drew her cloak around her, and Oswald took them down to their carriage. Aunt Lydia and I followed, and as we crossed the square we saw their cab going up the avenue. For many years I associated Mrs. Henshaw with that music, thought of that aria as being mysteriously related to something in her nature that one rarely saw, but nearly always felt, a compelling, passionate, overmastering something for which I had no name, but which was audible, visible in the air that night as she sat crouching in the shadow. When I wanted to recall powerfully that hidden richness in her, I had only to close my eyes and sing to myself, "Casta Diva, Casta Diva." End of Part 1, Section 5. Part 1, Section 6 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 1, Section 6. On Saturday I was to lunch at the Henshaws and go alone with Oswald to hear Bernhardt and Kukelan. As I opened the door into the entry hall, the first thing that greeted me was Mrs. Henshaw's angry laugh and a burst of rapid words that stung like cold water from a spray. "I tell you I will know the truth about this key, and I will go through any door your keys open. Is that clear?" Oswald answered with a distinctly malicious chuckle. "My dear, you'd have a hard time getting through that door. The key happens to open a safety deposit box." Her voice rose an octave in pitch. "How dare you lie to me, Oswald? How dare you? They told me at your bank that this wasn't a bank key, though it looks like one. I stopped and showed it to them the day you forgot your keys and telephoned me to bring them down to your office." "The hell you did!" I coughed and rapped at the door. They took no notice of me. I heard Oswald push back a chair. "Then it was you who took my keys out of my pocket." "I might have known it. I never forget to change them. And you went to the bank and made me and yourself ridiculous. I can imagine their amusement." "Well, you needn't. I know how to get information without giving any. Here is Nellie Birdseye rapping at the gates. Come in, Nellie. You and Oswald are going over to Martin's for lunch. He and I are quarreling about a key ring. There will be no luncheon here today." She went away, and I stood bewildered. This delightful room had seemed to me a place where light-heartedness and charming manners lived, housed there just as the purple curtains and the Kiva rugs and the gay water-colors were, and now everything was in ruins. The air was still and cold like the air in a refrigerating room. What I felt was fear. I was afraid to look or speak or move. Everything about me seemed evil. When kindness has left people, even for a few moments, we become afraid of them, as if their reason had left them. When it has left a place where we have always found it, it is like shipwreck. We drop from security into something malevolent and bottomless. "It's all right, Nellie." Oswald recovered himself and put a hand on my shoulder. "Myra isn't half so furious with me as she pretends. I'll get my hat and we'll be off." He was in his smoking jacket and had been sitting at his desk writing. His inkwell was uncovered, and on the blotter lay a half-written sheet of notepaper. I was glad to get out into the sunlight with him. The city seemed safe and friendly and smiling. The air in that room had been like poison. Oswald tried to make it up to me. We walked round and round the square, and at Martin's he made me drink a glass of sherry, and pointed out the interesting people in the dining room, and told me stories about them. But without his hat, his head against the bright window, he looked tired and troubled. I wondered, as on the first time I saw him in my own town, at the contradiction in his face, the strong bones and the curiously shaped eyes without any fire in them. I felt that his life had not suited him, that he possessed some kind of courage and force which slept, which in another sort of world might have asserted themselves brilliantly. I thought he ought to have been a soldier or an explorer. I have since seen those half-moon eyes in other people, and they were always inscrutable, like his, fronted the world with courtesy and kindness, but one never got behind them. We went to the theatre, but I remember very little of the performance except a dull heartache and a conviction that I should never like Mrs. Myra so well again. That was on Saturday. On Monday, Aunt Lydia and I were to start for home. We positively did not see the Henshaws again. Sunday morning the maid came with some flowers and a note from Myra, saying that her friend Anne Allward was having a bad day and had sent for her. On Monday we took an early boat across the ferry in order to breakfast in the Jersey station before our train started. We had got settled in our places in the Pullman. The moment of departure was near, when we heard an amused laugh, and there was Myra Henshaw, coming into the car in her fur hat, followed by a porter who carried her bags. "I didn't plot anything so neat as this, Liddy," she laughed, a little out of breath, "though I knew we'd be on the same train. But we won't quarrel, will we? I'm only going as far as Pittsburgh. I have some old friends there. Oswald and I have had a disagreement, and I've left him to think it over. If he needs me, he can quite well come after me." All day Mrs. Myra was jolly and agreeable, though she treated us with light formality, as if we were new acquaintances. We lunched together, and I noticed, sitting opposite her, that when she was in this mood of high scorn, her mouth, which could be so tender, which cherished the names of her friends and spoke them delicately, was entirely different. It seemed to curl and twist about like a little snake. Letting herself think harm of anyone she loved seemed to change her nature, even her features. It was dark when we got into Pittsburgh. The Pullman porter took Myra's luggage to the end of the car. She bade us good-bye, started to leave us, then turned back with an icy little smile. "Oh, Liddy dear, you needn't have perjured yourself for those yellow cuff-buttons. I was sure to find out. I always do. I don't hold it against you, but it's disgusting in a man to lie for personal decorations. A woman might do it now. For pearls." With a bright nod she turned away and swept out of the car, her head high, the long garnet feather drooping behind. Aunt Lydia was very angry. "I'm sick of Myra's dramatics," she declared. "I've done with them. A man never is justified, but if ever a man was—" End of Part 1, Section 6. Part 2, Section 1 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 1. 10 years after that visit to New York, I happened to be in a sprawling, overgrown West Coast city, which was in the throes of rapid development. It ran about the shore, stumbling all over itself, and finally tumbled untidily into the sea. Every hotel and boarding house was overcrowded, and I was very poor. Things had gone badly with my family and with me. I had come west in the middle of the year to take a position in a college that was as experimental and unsubstantial as everything else in the place. I found lodgings in an apartment hotel, wretchedly built and already falling to pieces, although it was new. I moved in on a Sunday morning, and while I was unpacking my trunk, I heard, through the thin walls, my neighbor stirring about. A man, and from the huskiness of his cough, and something measured in his movements, not a young man. The caution of his step, the guarded consideration of his activities, let me know that he did not wish to thrust the details of his housekeeping upon other people any more than he could help. Presently I detected the ugly smell of gasoline in the air, heard a sound of silk being snapped and shaken, and then a voice humming very low an old German air. Yes, Schubert's Frühlingsglaube. Ta 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 ta. In a moment I saw the ends of dark neckties fluttering out of the window next mine. All this made me melancholy, more than the dreariness of my own case. I was young, and it didn't matter so much about me. For youth there is always the hope, the certainty of better things. But an old man, a gentleman living in this shabby, comfortless place, cleaning his neckties of a Sunday morning and humming to himself, it depressed me unreasonably. I was glad when his outer door shut softly, and I heard no more of him. There was an indifferent restaurant on the ground floor of the hotel. As I was going down to my dinner that evening, I met, at the head of the stairs, a man coming up and carrying a large black tin tray. His head was bent and his eyes were lowered. As he drew aside to let me pass, in spite of his thin white hair and stooped shoulders, I recognized Oswald Henshaw, whom I had not seen for so many years. Not, indeed, since that afternoon when he took me to see Sarah Bernhardt play Hamlet. When I called his name, he started, looked at me, and rested the tray on the sill of the blindless window that lighted the naked stairway. "Nellie? Nellie Birdseye, can it be?" His voice was quite uncertain. He seemed deeply shaken, and pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. "But, Nellie, you have grown up. I would not know you. What good fortune for Myra! She will hardly believe it when I tell her. She is ill, my poor Myra. Oh, very ill, but we must not speak of that, nor seem to know it. What it will mean to her to see you again. Her friends always were so much to her, you remember? Will you stop and see us as you come up? Her room is 32. Rap gently, and I'll be waiting for you. Now I must take her dinner. Oh, I hope for her sake you are staying some time. She has no one here." He took up the tray and went softly along the uncarpeted hall. I felt little zest for the canned vegetables and hard meat the waitress put before me. I had known that the Henshaws had come on evil days, and were wandering about among the cities of the Pacific coast. But Myra had stopped writing to Aunt Lydia, beyond a word of greeting at Christmas and on her birthday. She had ceased to give us any information about their way of life. We knew that several years after my memorable visit in New York, the railroad to whose president Oswald had long been private secretary was put into the hands of a receiver, and the retiring president went abroad to live. Henshaw had remained with the new management, but very soon the road was taken over by one of the great trunk lines, and the office staff was cut in two. In the reorganization, Henshaw was offered a small position, which he indignantly refused. His wife wouldn't let him think of accepting it. He went to San Francisco as manager of a commission house. The business failed, and what had happened to them since I did not know. I lingered long over my dismal dinner. I had not the courage to go upstairs. Henshaw was not more than 60, but he looked much older. He had the tired face of one who has utterly lost hope. Oswald had got his wife up out of bed to receive me. When I entered, she was sitting in a wheelchair by an open window, wrapped in a Chinese dressing gown, with a bright shawl over her feet. She threw out both arms to me, and as she hugged me, flashed into her old gay laugh. "Now, wasn't it clever of you to find us, Nellie? And we so safely hidden in earth like a pair of old foxes. But it was in the cards that we should meet again. Now I understand. A wise woman has been coming to read my fortune for me, and the Queen of Hearts has been coming up out of the pack when she had no business to. A beloved friend coming out of the past. Well, Nellie dear, I couldn't think of any old friends that weren't better away, for one reason or another, while we are in temporary eclipse. I gain strength faster if I haven't people on my mind. But you, Nellie, that's different." She put my 2 hands to her cheeks, making a frame for her face. "That's different. Somebody young and clear-eyed, chock-full of opinions, and without a past. But you may have a past already? The darkest ones come early." I was delighted. She was herself, Myra Henshaw. I hadn't expected anything so good. The electric bulbs in the room were shrouded and muffled with colored scarves, and in that light she looked much less changed than Oswald. The corners of her mouth had relaxed a little, but they could still curl very scornfully upon occasion. Her nose was the same sniffy little nose, with its restless arched nostrils, and her double chin, though softer, was no fuller. A strong cable of gray-black hair was wound on the top of her head, which, as she once remarked, was no head for a woman at all, but would have graced one of the wickedest of the Roman emperors. Her bed was in the alcove behind her. In the shadowy dimness of the room I recognized some of the rugs from their New York apartment, some of the old pictures, with frames peeling and glass cracked. Here was Myra's little inlaid tea-table, and the desk at which Oswald had been writing that day when I dropped in upon their quarrel. At the windows were the dear plum-colored curtains, their cream lining streaked and faded, but the sight of them rejoiced me more than I could tell the Henshaws. "And where did you come from, Nellie? What are you doing here, in heaven's name?" While I explained myself, she listened intently, holding my wrist with one of her beautiful little hands, which were so inexplicably mischievous in their outline, and which, I noticed, were still white and well cared for. But teaching, Nellie, I don't like that, not even for a temporary expedient. It's a cul-de-sac. Generous young people use themselves all up at it. They have no sense. Only the stupid and the phlegmatic should teach. But won't you allow me, too, a temporary eclipse? She laughed and squeezed my hand. We wouldn't be hiding in the shadow if we were 25. We were throwing off sparks like a pair of shooting stars, weren't we, Oswald? No, I can't bear teaching for you, Nellie. Why not journalism? You could always make your way easily there. Because I hate journalism. I know what I want to do, and I'll work my way out yet. if only you'll give me time." "Very well, dear," she sighed. "But I'm ambitious for you. I've no patience with young people when they drift. I wish I could live their lives for them. I'd know how. But there it is. By the time you've learned the shortcuts, your feet puff up so that you can't take the road at all. Now tell me about your mother and my Lydia." I had hardly begun when she lifted one finger and sniffed the air. "Do you get it? That bitter smell of the sea? It's apt to come in on the night wind. I live on it. Sometimes I can still take a drive along the shore." "Go on. You say that Lydia and your mother are at present in disputation about the possession of your late grandfather's portrait. Why don't you cut it in two for them, Nellie? I remember it perfectly, and half of it would be enough for anybody." While I told her any amusing gossip I could remember about my family, she sat crippled but powerful in her brilliant wrappings. She looked strong and broken, generous and tyrannical, a witty and rather wicked old woman who hated life for its defeats and loved it for its absurdities. I recalled her angry laugh, and how she had always greeted shock or sorrow with that dry, exultant chuckle which seemed to say, "Aha! I have one more piece of evidence, one more against the hideous injustice God permits in this world." While we were talking, the silence of the strangely balmy February evening was rudely disturbed by the sound of doors slamming and heavy tramping overhead. Mrs. Henshaw winced. A look of apprehension and helplessness, a tortured expression came over her face. She turned sharply to her husband, who was resting peacefully in one of their old deep chairs over by the muffled light. "There they are, those animals!" He sat up. "They have just come back from church," he said in a troubled voice. "Why should I have to know when they come back from church? Why should I have the details of their stupid, messy existence thrust upon me all day long and half the night?" she broke out bitterly. Her features became tense as from an attack of pain, and I realized how unable she was to bear things. "We are unfortunate in the people who live over us," Oswald explained. "They annoy us a great deal. These new houses are poorly built and every sound carries." "Couldn't you ask them to walk more quietly?" I suggested. He smiled and shook his head. "We have, but it seems to make them worse. They are that kind of people." His wife broke in. "The palavery kind of Southerners, all that slushy gush on the surface and no sensibilities whatever. A race without consonance and without delicacy. They tramp up there all day long like cattle. The stalled ox would have trod softer. Their energy isn't worth anything, so they use it up gabbling and running about, beating my brains into a jelly." She had scarcely stopped for breath when I heard a telephone ring overhead, then shrieks of laughter, and two people ran across the floor as if they were running a foot race. "You hear?" Mrs. Henshaw looked at me triumphantly. "Those two silly old hens race each other to the telephone as if they had a sweetheart at the other end of it." While I could still climb stairs, I hobbled up to that woman and implored her, and she began gushing about "my sister" and "my son," and what refined people they were. Oh, that's the cruelty of being poor. It leaves you at the mercy of such pigs. Money is a protection, a cloak. It can buy one quiet and some sort of dignity. She leaned back exhausted and shut her eyes. "Come, Nellie," said Oswald softly. He walked down the hall to my door with me. "I'm sorry the disturbance began while you were there. Sometimes they go to the movies and stay out later," he said mournfully. I've talked to that woman and to her son, but they are very unfeeling people." "But wouldn't the management interfere in a case of sickness?" Again he shook his head. "No, they pay a higher rent than we do, occupy more rooms, and we are somewhat under obligation to the management." End of Part 2, Section 1. Part 2, Section 3 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 3. The next morning I saw Henshaw breakfasting in the restaurant against his custom, so I judged that his wife was still in retreat. I was glad to see that he was not alone, but was talking, with evident pleasure, to a young girl who lived with her mother at this hotel. I had noticed her respectful admiration for Henshaw on other occasions. She worked on a newspaper, was intelligent, and, Oswald thought, promising. We enjoyed talking with her at lunch or dinner. She was perhaps 18, overgrown and awkward, with short hair and a rather heavy face, but there was something unusual about her clear, honest eyes that made one wonder. She was always on the watch to catch a moment with Oswald, to get him to talk to her about music, or German poetry, or about the actors and writers he had known. He called her his little chum, and her admiration was undoubtedly a help to him. It was very pretty and naive. Perhaps that was one of the things that kept him up to the mark in his dress and manner. Among people, he never looked apologetic or crushed. He still wore his topaz sleeve buttons. On Monday, as I came home from school, I saw that the door of Mrs. Henshaw's room was slightly ajar. She knew my step and called to me. "Can you come in, Nellie?" She was staying in bed that afternoon, but she had on her best dressing-gown, and she was manicuring her neat little hands, a good sign, I thought. "Could you stop and have tea with me and talk? I'll be good today, I promise you. I wakened up in the night crying, and it did me good. You see, I was crying about things I never feel now. I'd been dreaming I was young, and the sorrows of youth had set me crying." She took my hand as I sat down beside her. "Do you know that poem of Heine's about how he found in his eye a tear that was not of the present, an old one left over from the kind he used to weep, a tear that belonged to a long dead time of his life and was an anachronism? He couldn't account for it, yet there it was, and he addresses it so prettily. Thou old lonesome tear. Would you read it for me? There's my little Heine on the shelf over the sofa. You can easily find the verse. Du alte einsame Träne." I ran through the volume, reading a poem here and there where a leaf had been turned down, or where I saw a line I knew well. It was a fat old book with yellow pages, bound in tooled leather, and on the fly-leaf, in faint violet ink, was an inscription, "To Myra Driscoll from Oswald, dated 1876. My friend lay still with her eyes closed, and occasionally one of those anachronistic tears gathered on her lashes and fell on the pillow, making a little gray spot. Often she took the verse out of my mouth and finished it herself. "Look for a little short one about the flower that grows on the suicide's grave. Die arme Sonderblume, the poor sinner's flower." "Oh, that's the flower for me, Nellie. Die arme Sonderblume." She drew the word out until it was a poem in itself. "Come, dear," she said presently when I put down the book. "You don't really like this new verse that's going round? Ugly lines about ugly people and common feelings? You don't really?" When I reminded her that she liked Walt Whitman, she chuckled slyly. "Does that save me? Can I get into your new Parnassus on that dirty old man?" I suppose I ought to be glad of any sort of ticket at my age. I like naughty rhymes when they don't try to be pompous. I like the kind bad boys write on fences. My uncle had a rare collection of such rhymes in his head that he'd pick off fences and outbuildings. I wish I'd taken them down. I might become a poet of note. My uncle was a very unusual man. Did they ever tell you much about him at home? Yes, he had violent prejudices, but that's rather good to remember in these days when so few people have any real passions, either of love or hate. He would help a friend, no matter what it cost him. And over again he risked ruining himself to crush an enemy. But he never did ruin himself. Men who hate like that usually have the fist power to back it up, you'll notice. He gave me fair warning, and then he kept his word. I knew he would. We were enough alike for that. He left his money wisely. Part of it went to establish a home for aged and destitute women in Chicago, where it was needed. While we were talking about this institution and some of the refugees it sheltered, Myra said suddenly, "I wonder if you know about a clause concerning me in that foundation. It states that at any time the founder's niece, Myra Driscoll Henshaw, is to be received into the institution, kept without charge, and paid an allowance of $10 a week for pocket money until the time of her death. How like the old Satan that was! Be sure when he dictated that provision to his lawyer, he thought to himself, 'She'd roll herself into the river first, the Brock.' And then he probably thought better of me and maybe died with some decent feeling for me in his heart. We were very proud of each other, and if he'd lived till now, I'd go back to him and ask his pardon, because I know what it is to be old and lonely and disappointed. Yes, and because as we grow old we become more and more the stuff our forebears put into us. I can feel his savagery strengthen in me. We think we are so individual and so misunderstood when we are young, but the nature our strain of blood carries is inside there, waiting like our skeleton." It had grown quite dusk while we talked. When I rose and turned on one of the shrouded lights, Mrs. Henshaw looked up at me and smiled drolly. "We've had a fine afternoon," and Biddy, forgetting her ails, "How the great poets do shine on, Nellie! Into all the dark corners of the world they have no night." They shone for her, certainly. Miss Sterling, a nice young person from the library, as Myra called her, ran in occasionally with new books. But Myra's eyes tired quickly, and she used to shut a new book and lie back and repeat the old ones she knew by heart, the long declamations from Richard II or King John. As I passed her door, I would hear her murmuring, at the very bottom of her rich Irish voice, "Old John of Gaunt, time-honored Lancaster." End of Part 2, Section 3. Part 2, Section 3 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 3. The next morning I saw Henshaw breakfasting in the restaurant against his custom, so I judged that his wife was still in retreat. I was glad to see that he was not alone, but was talking, with evident pleasure, to a young girl who lived with her mother at this hotel. I had noticed her respectful admiration for Henshaw on other occasions. She worked on a newspaper, was intelligent, and, Oswald thought, promising. We enjoyed talking with her at lunch or dinner. She was perhaps 18, overgrown and awkward, with short hair and a rather heavy face, but there was something unusual about her clear, honest eyes that made one wonder. She was always on the watch to catch a moment with Oswald, to get him to talk to her about music, or German poetry, or about the actors and writers he had known. He called her his little chum, and her admiration was undoubtedly a help to him. It was very pretty and naive. Perhaps that was one of the things that kept him up to the mark in his dress and manner. Among people, he never looked apologetic or crushed. He still wore his topaz sleeve buttons. On Monday, as I came home from school, I saw that the door of Mrs. Henshaw's room was slightly ajar. She knew my step and called to me. "Can you come in, Nellie?" She was staying in bed that afternoon, but she had on her best dressing gown, and she was manicuring her neat little hands. A good sign, I thought. "Could you stop and have tea with me and talk? I'll be good today, I promise you. I wakened up in the night crying, and it did me good. You see, I was crying about things I never feel now. I'd been dreaming I was young, and the sorrows of youth had set me crying." She took my hand as I sat down beside her. "Do you know that poem of Heine's about how he found in his eye a tear that was not of the present, an old one left over from the kind he used to weep, a tear that belonged to a long dead time of his life and was an anachronism? He couldn't account for it, yet there it was, and he addresses it so prettily. Thou old lonesome tear. Would you read it for me? There's my little Heine on the shelf over the sofa. You can easily find the verse. Du alte einsame Träne." I ran through the volume, reading a poem here and there where a leaf had been turned down, or where I saw a line I knew well. It was a fat old book with yellow pages, bound in tooled leather, and on the fly-leaf, in faint violet ink, was an inscription, "To Myra Driscoll from Oswald, dated 1876. My friend lay still with her eyes closed, and occasionally one of those anachronistic tears gathered on her lashes and fell on the pillow, making a little gray spot. Often she took the verse out of my mouth and finished it herself. "Look for a little short one about the flower that grows on the suicide's grave. Die arme Zunderblume, the poor sinner's flower." "Oh, that's the flower for me, Nellie. Die arme Zunderblume." She drew the word out until it was a poem in itself. "Come, dear," she said presently when I put down the book. "You don't really like this new verse that's going round, ugly lines about ugly people and common feelings? You don't really?" When I reminded her that she liked Walt Whitman, she chuckled slyly. "Does that save me? Can I get into your new Parnassus on that dirty old man? I suppose I ought to be glad of any sort of ticket at my age. I like naughty rhymes when they don't try to be pompous. I like the kind bad boys write on fences. My uncle had a rare collection of such rhymes in his head that he'd pick off fences and outbuildings. I wish I'd taken them down. I might become a poet of note." My uncle was a very unusual man. "Did they ever tell you much about him at home?" "Yes, he had violent prejudices, but that's rather good to remember in these days when so few people have any real passions, either of love or hate. He would help a friend, no matter what it cost him. And over again he risked ruining himself to crush an enemy. But he never did ruin himself. Men who hate like that usually have the fist power to back it up, you'll notice. He gave me fair warning, and then he kept his word. I knew he would. We were enough alike for that. He left his money wisely. Part of it went to establish a home for aged and destitute women in Chicago, where it was needed." While we were talking about this institution and some of the refugees it sheltered, Myra said suddenly, "I wonder if you know about a clause concerning me in that foundation. It states that at any time the founder's niece, Myra Driscoll Henshaw, is to be received into the institution, kept without charge, and paid an allowance of $10 a week for pocket money, until the time of her death. How like the old Satan that was! Be sure when he dictated that provision to his lawyer, he thought to himself, she'd roll herself into the river first, the brack. And then he probably thought better of me and maybe died with some decent feeling for me in his heart. We were very proud of each other, and if he'd lived till now, I'd go back to him and ask his pardon, because I know what it is to be old and lonely and disappointed. Yes, and because as we grow old we become more and more the stuff our forebears put into us. I can feel his savagery strengthen in me. We think we are so individual and so misunderstood when we are young, but the nature our strain of blood carries is inside there, waiting like our skeleton. It had grown quite dusk while we talked. When I rose and turned on one of the shrouded lights, Mrs. Henshaw looked up at me and smiled drolly. "We've had a fine afternoon," and Biddy, forgetting her ails, "How the great poets do shine on, Nellie! Into all the dark corners of the world they have no night." They shone for her, certainly. Miss Sterling, a nice young person from the library, as Myra called her, ran in occasionally with new books, but Myra's eyes tired quickly, and she used to shut a new book and lie back and repeat the old ones she knew by heart, the long declamations from Richard II or King John. As I passed her door, I would hear her murmuring, at the very bottom of her rich Irish voice, "Old John of Gaunt, time-honoured Lancaster." End of Part 2, Section 3. Part 2, Section 4 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 4. One afternoon when I got home from school, I found a note from Mrs. Henshaw under my door and went to her at once. She greeted me and kissed me with unusual gravity. "Nellie, dear, will you do a very special favor for me tomorrow? It is the 15th of April, the anniversary of Madame Modjeska's death." She gave me a key and asked me to open an old trunk in the corner. "Lift the tray, and in the bottom at one end you will find an old pair of long kid gloves tied up like sacks. Please give them to me." I burrowed down under old evening wraps and dinner dresses and came upon the gloves, yellow with age and tied at both ends with corset lacings. They contained something heavy that jingled. Myra was watching my face and chuckled. Is she thinking they are my wedding gloves, piously preserved? No, my dear, I went before a justice of the peace and married without gloves, so to speak. Untying the string, she shook out a little rain of $10 and $20 gold pieces. "All old Irish women hide away a bit of money." She took up a coin and gave it to me. "Will you go to St. Joseph's Church and inquire for Father Fay? Tell him you are from me and ask him to celebrate a Mass tomorrow for the repose of the soul of Helena Modjeska, Countess Bozenta Klapowska. He will remember. Last year I hobbled there myself." "You are surprised, Nellie." "Yes, I broke with the church when I broke with everything else and ran away with a German freethinker. But I believe in holy words and holy rites all the same. It is a solace to me to know that tomorrow a Mass will be said here in heathendom for the spirit of that noble artist, that beautiful and gracious woman." When I put the gold back into the trunk and started making the tea, she said, "Oswald, of course, doesn't know the extent of my resources. We've often needed $100 or two so bitter bad he wouldn't understand. But that is the money I keep for unearthly purposes. The needs of this world don't touch it." As I was leaving, she called me back. "Oh, Nellie, can't we go to Gloucester's Cliff on Saturday if it's fine? I do long to." We went again and again, Nothing else seemed to give her so much pleasure. But the third time I stopped for her, she declared she was not equal to it. I found her sitting in her chair, trying to write to an old friend, an Irish actress I had met at her apartment in New York, one of the guests at that New Year's Eve party. Her son, a young actor, had shot himself in Chicago because of some sordid love affair. I had seen an account of it in the morning paper. "It touches me very nearly," Mrs. Henshaw told me. "Why, I used to keep Billy with me for weeks together when his mother was off on tour. He was the most truthful, noble-hearted little fellow. I had so hoped he would be happy. You remember his mother?" I remembered her very well. Large and jovial and hearty she was. Myra began telling me about her and the son, whom she had not seen since he was 16. To throw his youth away like that and shoot himself at 23. People are always talking about the joys of youth, but oh, how youth can suffer. I've not forgotten those hot southern Illinois nights when Oswald was in New York and I had no word from him except through Liddy, and I used to lie on the floor all night and listen to the express trains go by. I've not forgotten." "Then I wonder why you are sometimes so hard on him now," I murmured. Mrs. Henshaw did not reply to me at once. The corners of her mouth trembled, then drew tight, and she sat with her eyes closed as if she were gathering herself for something. At last she sighed and looked at me wistfully. "It's a great pity, isn't it, Nellie, to reach out a grudging hand and try to spoil the past for anyone? Yes, it's a great cruelty, but I can't help it. He's a sentimentalist, always was. He can look back on the best of those days when we were young and loved each other, and make himself believe it was all like that. It wasn't. I was always a grasping, worldly woman. I was never satisfied. All the same, in age when the flowers are so few, it's a great unkindness to destroy any that are left in a man's heart." The tears rolled down her cheeks. She leaned back, looking up at the ceiling. She had stopped speaking because her voice broke. Presently she began again resolutely. "But I'm made so. People can be lovers and enemies at the same time, you know. A man and woman draw apart from that long embrace and see what they have done to each other. Perhaps I can't forgive him for the harm I did him. Perhaps that's it. When there are children, that feeling goes through natural changes, but when it remains so personal, something gives way in one. In age we lose everything, even the power to love." "He hasn't," I suggested. "He has asked you to speak for him, my dear. Then we have destroyed each other indeed." "Certainly he hasn't, Mrs. Myra. But you are hard on him, you know, and when there are so many hard things, it seems a pity." "Yes, it's a great pity." She drew herself up in her chair. "And I'd rather you didn't come any more for the time being, Nellie. I've been thinking the tea made me nervous." She was smiling, but her mouth curled like a little snake, as I had seen it do long ago. "Will you be pleased to take your things and go, Mrs. Casey?" She said it with a laugh, but a very meaning one. As I rose, I watched for some sign of relenting, and I said humbly enough, "Forgive me if I've said anything I shouldn't. You know I love you very dearly." She mockingly bowed her tyrant's head. "It's owing to me infirmities, dear Mrs. Casey, that I will not be able to go as far as me door with ye." End of Part 2, Section 4. Part 2, Section 5 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 5. For days after that episode I did not see Mrs. Henshaw at all. I saw Oswald at dinner in the restaurant every night, and he reported her condition to me as if nothing had happened. The short-haired newspaper girl often came to our table, and the three of us talked together. I could see that he got great refreshment from her. Her questions woke pleasant trains of recollection, and her straightforward affection was dear to him. Once Myra, in telling me that it was a pleasure to him to have me come into their lives again thus, had remarked, "He was always a man to feel women, you know, in every way." It was true. That crude little girl made all the difference in the world to him. He was generous enough to become quite light-hearted in directing her inexperience and her groping hunger for life. He even read her poor little specials and showed her what was worst in them and what was good. She took correction well, he told me. Early in June, Mrs. Henshaw began to grow worse. Her doctors told us a malignant growth in her body had taken hold of a vital organ, and that she would hardly live through the month. She suffered intense pain from pressure on the nerves in her back, and they gave her opiates freely. At first we had 2 nurses, but Myra hated the night nurse so intensely that we dismissed her, and as my school was closed for the summer, I took turns with Oswald in watching over her at night. She needed little attention except renewed doses of codeine. She slept deeply for a few hours, and the rest of the night lay awake, murmuring to herself long passages from her old poets. Myra kept beside her now an ebony crucifix with an ivory Christ. It used to hang on the wall, and I had supposed she carried it about because some friend had given it to her. I felt now that she had it by her for a different reason. Once when I picked it up from her bed to straighten her sheet, she put out her hand quickly and said, "Give it to me. It means nothing to people who haven't suffered." She talked very little after this last stage of her illness began. She no longer complained or lamented, but toward Oswald her manner became strange and dark. She had certain illusions. The noise overhead she now attributed entirely to her husband. "Ah, there he's beginning it again," she would say. "He'll wear me down in the end. Oh, let me be buried in the King's highway." When Oswald lifted her or did anything for her now, she was careful to thank him in a guarded, sometimes a cringing tone. "It's bitter enough that I should have to take service from you, you whom I have loved so well," I heard her say to him. When she asked us to use candles for light during our watches, and to have no more of the electric light she hated, she said accusingly, at him rather than to him, "At least let me die by candlelight. That is not too much to ask." Father Fay came to see her almost daily now. His visits were long, and she looked forward to them. I was, of course, not in her room when he was there, but if he met me in the corridor he stopped to speak to me, and once he walked down the street with me talking of her. He was a young man with a fresh face and pleasant eyes, and he was deeply interested in Myra. "She's a most unusual woman, Mrs. Henshaw," he said when he was walking down the street beside me. Then he added, smiling quite boyishly, "I wonder whether some of the saints of the early church weren't a good deal like her. She's not at all modern in her make-up, is she?" During those days and nights when she talked so little, one felt that Myra's mind was busy all the while, that it was even abnormally active, and occasionally one got a clue to what occupied it. One night when I was giving her her coating, she asked me a question. "Why is it, do you suppose, Nellie, that candles are in themselves religious? Not when they are covered by shades, of course. I mean the flame of a candle. Is it because the church began in the catacombs, perhaps?" At another time, when she had been lying like a marble figure for a long while, she said in a gentle, reasonable voice, "Ah, Father Fay, that isn't the reason. Religion is different from everything else, because in religion, seeking is finding." She accented the word seeking very strongly, very deeply. She seemed to say that in other searchings it might be the object of the quest that brought satisfaction, or it might be something incidental that one got on the way. But in religion, desire was fulfillment. It was the seeking itself that rewarded. One of those nights of watching stands out in my memory as embracing them all, as being the burden and the telling the tale of them all. Myra had had a very bad day, so both Oswald and I were sitting up with her. After midnight she was quiet. The candles were burning as usual, one in her alcove. From my chair by the open window I could see her bed. She had been motionless for more than an hour, lying on her back, her eyes closed. I thought she was asleep. The city outside was as still as the room in which we sat. The sick woman began to talk to herself, scarcely above a whisper, but with perfect distinctness, a voice that was hardly more than a soft, passionate breath. I seemed to hear a soul talking. "I could bear to suffer, so many have suffered, but why must it be like this? I have not deserved it. I have been true in friendship. I have faithfully nursed others in sickness. Why must I die like this, alone with my mortal enemy?" Oswald was sitting on the sofa, his face shaded by his hand. I looked at him in affright, but he did not move or shudder. I felt my hands grow cold, and my forehead grow moist with dread. I had never heard a human voice utter such a terrible judgment upon all one hopes for. As I sat on through the night, after Oswald had gone to catch a few hours of sleep, I grew calmer. I began to understand a little what she meant, to sense how it was with her. Violent natures like hers sometimes turn against themselves and all their idolatries. End of Part 2, Section 5. Part 2, Section 6 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 6. On the following day, Mrs. Henshaw asked to be given the sacrament. After she had taken it, she seemed easier in mind and body. In the afternoon, she told Henshaw to go to his office, and begged me to leave her and let her sleep. The nurse we had sent away that day at her urgent request. She wanted to be cared for by one of the nursing sisters from the convent from now on, and Father Fay was to bring one tomorrow. I went to my room, meaning to go back to her in an hour, but once on my bed I slept without waking. It was dark when I heard Henshaw knocking on my door and calling to me. As I opened it, he said in a despairing tone, "She's gone, Nellie. She's gone." I thought he meant she had died. I hurried after him down the corridor and into her room. It was empty. He pointed to her empty bed. "Don't you see? She has gone, God knows where. But how could she, a woman so ill? She must be somewhere in the building. I've been all over the house. You don't know her, Nellie. She can do anything she wills. Look at this." On the desk lay a sheet of notepaper scribbled in lead pencil. "Dear Oswald, my hour has come. Don't follow me. I wish to be alone. Nellie knows where there is money for masses." That was all. There was no signature. We hurried to the police station. The chief sent a messenger out to the men on the beat to warn them to be on the watch for a distraught woman who had wandered out in delirium. Then we went to Father Fay. "The church has been on her mind for a long while," said Henshaw. "It is one of her delusions that I separated her from the church. I never meant to." The young priest knew nothing. He was distressed and offered to help us in our search, but we thought he had better stay at home on the chance that she might come to him. When we got back to the hotel, it was after 11 o'clock. Oswald said he could not stay indoors. I must be there within call, but he would go back to help the police. After he left, I began to search Mrs. Henshaw's room. She had worn her heavy coat and her furs, though the night was warm. When I found that the pair of Austrian blankets was missing, I felt I knew where she had gone. Should I try to get Oswald at the police station? I sat down to think it over. It seemed to me that she ought to be allowed to meet the inevitable end in the way she chose. A yearning strong enough to lift that ailing body and drag it out into the world again should have its way. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Henshaw came back with an officer and a Negro cabman. The driver had come to the station and reported that at 6 last night a lady, with her arms full of wraps, had signaled him at the side door of the hotel and told him to drive her to the boat landing. When they were nearing the landing, she said she did not mean to stop there, but wanted to go farther up the shore, giving him clear directions. They reached the cliff she had indicated. He helped her out of the cab, put her rugs under the tree for her, and she gave him a $10 gold piece and dismissed him. He protested that the fare was too much and that he was afraid of getting into trouble if he left her there. But she told him a friend was going to meet her and that it would be all right. The lady had, he said, a very kind, coaxing way with her. When he went to the stable to put up his horse, he heard that the police were looking for a woman who was out of her head, and he was frightened. He went home and talked it over with his wife, who sent him to report at headquarters. The cabman drove us out to the headland, and the officer insisted upon going along. We found her wrapped in her blankets, leaning against the cedar trunk, facing the sea. Her head had fallen forward. The ebony crucifix was in her hands. She must have died peacefully and painlessly. There was every reason to believe she had lived to see the dawn. While we watched beside her, waiting for the undertaker and Father Fay to come, I told Oswald what she had said to me about longing to behold the morning break over the sea, and it comforted him. End of Part 2, Section 6. Part 2, Section 7 of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, Section 7. Although she had returned so ardently to the faith of her childhood, Myra Henshaw never changed the clause in her will, which requested that her body should be cremated and her ashes buried in some lonely and unfrequented place in the mountains or in the sea. After it was all over and her ashes sealed up in a little steel box, Henshaw called me into her room one morning, where he was packing her things, and told me he was going to Alaska. "Oh, not to seek my fortune," he said, smiling. "That is for young men. But the steamship company have a place for me in their office there. I have always wanted to go, and now there is nothing to hold me. This poor little box goes with me. I shall scatter her ashes somewhere in those vast waters. And this I want you to keep for remembrance." He dropped into my hands the necklace of carved amethysts she had worn on the night I first saw her. "And Nellie," he paused before me with his arms folded, standing exactly as he stood behind Modjeska's chair in the moonlight on that New Year's night, standing like a statue or a sentinel, I had said then, not knowing what it was I felt in his attitude. But now I knew it meant indestructible constancy, almost indestructible youth. "Nellie," he said, "I don't want you to remember her as she was here. Remember her as she was when you were with us on Madison Square, when she was herself and we were happy. Yes, happier than it falls to the lot of most mortals to be. After she was stricken, her recollection of those things darkened. Life was hard for her, but it was glorious, too. She had such beautiful friendships. Of course, she was absolutely unreasonable when she was jealous. Her suspicions were sometimes almost fantastic." He smiled and brushed his forehead with the tips of his fingers, as if the memory of her jealousy was pleasant still, and perplexing still. "But that was just Molly Driscoll. I'd rather have been clawed by her, as she used to say, than petted by any other woman I've ever known. These last years it seemed to me that I was nursing the mother of the girl who ran away with me. Nothing ever took that girl from me. She was a wild, lovely creature, Nellie. I wish you could have seen her then." Several years after I said goodbye to him, Oswald Henshaw died in Alaska. I have still the string of amethysts, but they are unlucky. If I take them out of their box and wear them, I feel all evening a chill over my heart. Sometimes, when I have watched the bright beginning of a love story, when I have seen a common feeling exalted into beauty by imagination, generosity, and the flaming courage of youth, I have heard again that strange complaint breathed by a dying woman into the stillness of night, like a confession of the soul. Why must I die like this, alone, with my mortal enemy? End of Part 2, Section 7. End of My Mortal Enemy by Willa Cather.